Hey everybody, this is Jonathan Schrantz, and in this video I'm going to show you 3 separate unique systems that you can play against the London system. If you're anything like me, you know exactly how annoying it can be when the opponent plays the London. A lot of people hate to face this, and the reason is, at least at the beginner level, most people aren't going to be playing any interesting lines. White just has developed this little system. You build your triangle, you get your knight out, you get your bishop out, you get castled. And the problem is it's actually a very reasonable system for white. It's a very good setup. The London is a good opening, but it can be exhaustively boring to play against. So for that reason, I've come up with 3 different lines that I just kind of want to share with you guys today. I know we're all busy, so I will leave the timestamps in the description below. So if you do want to just jump around and pick just one of them, they will be down there for you. Just go look it up. And the 3 systems that I'm going to share with you guys, the first one I'm going to call Safe and Sound. This is a very reasonable attempt for black to just simply equalize. It's a little bit offbeat, but probably if you're a true London player, this has been on the radar, or this idea has been on the radar. But it's kind of the how to play boring and equalize against the London. If that's not for you, the second option will be a very rare line that I actually think is quite good. So if you are looking for something that's both rare and potentially dangerous for white, that is the line that you're going to want to look at. And the third line is just going to be an unnecessarily aggressive line, the most dubious line that I'm going to be showing, but it is very interesting, and I actually will share a game that I just played that actually inspired this entire video. With all of that in mind, let's take a look now at our very first approach against the London. This is the Safe and Sound approach. So if you're just looking to potentially equalize against the London and just get a playable position and take it from there, this is the line for you. And whether you're a knight f6 player or a pawn to d5 player, either way it will transpose. You can play a lot of these moves out of order as both sides, but essentially as black we're going to set up this pawn structure, and after a move such as knight to f3, we're going to play c5. You also can start with bishop to d6. All of this is very normal. But in some move order, we are going to get this very mainline position where very often white can decide to actually allow you to take here and just say, I'm going to try to control the e5 square, even at the cost of double pawns. But most players are going to retreat the bishop. And here is actually where we're going to start to deviate slightly from the main lines. In the main line, black is actually going to be castling, putting the knight on c6, and taking it from there. But I have found it's actually very easy for black to eventually get the move e5, this liberating pawn break, if you set up your pieces just a little bit differently here. And one approach is to play queen to c7. The idea is we're protecting the bishop because we want to put the other knight on d7. And this bishop is going to get into the game by b6, bishop to b7. Eventually we'll get castled, and eventually we might be able to play pawn to e5. And if we get this break in successfully, most likely we're just going to equalize. So here, one move that you can play in a position similar to this is queen to c7, and after white plays any one of their normal developing moves, we will also develop our knight. They can develop their bishop, and we can castle or even just play b6 now. At some point, both sides probably will get castled. A good rule of thumb in this line is that as soon as white has actually castled in whatever move order they get there, that becomes a now reasonable opportunity for us to trade this bishop, with the idea that now, after these doubled pawns, there's no rook here on the h-file, so something like this would be totally safe and sound. And after the bishop comes to b7, we're simply going to try to castle, and we're going to try to play pawn to e5. Something like this will be really close to equality here, and potentially black even can get a very slightly better position in such structures. For example, if something like rook to e1 castles and they let us just play a move like pawn to e5, what can typically happen is this series of trades will happen, and after a move like this, black probably is definitely better after queen to e7, probably after queen to c7. You definitely shouldn't have that many problems. And there's even a trick that you can potentially play for with putting the queen on h5, the knight on g4, and then maybe you can put your rooks in the center, and you can try to blast through, trade off this knight, and try to land some attack here. It usually won't work, but there's just a lot of ways to try to play for a win, even if you're the higher rated player with the black pieces and you need to win. There is some room for trying to play for a win here, but this approach doesn't necessarily give you the best winning chances. So if you are actually just looking for a really easy system, something that you can play over and over against the London, this might be a very reliable way of doing it. So just remember to play this pawn structure, put your knight on f6, queen on c7, develop your knights and bishops like this, get castled, and try to play for the e5 pawn break. Something like this should be very reasonable for black. And yeah, I mean, you really shouldn't have too many problems if you do decide to play this way. So if you're trying to balance something that's completely surprising with something that is actually legit and not dubious, this might be the approach for you. After pawn to d4, knight f6, I think on move 2 here, we might actually be able to shock our opponents with this very interesting idea, pawn to c6. And I will be showing you a game I played against a 2100 in a 3-minute game on leechess.org to kind of illustrate how difficult it can be for the opponent to figure this one out. And pawn to c6 has a very interesting idea. We are going to try to exploit the fact that after bishop to f4, not only might this bishop potentially become a target, like for example, we have ideas of knight to h5, just trying to hunt down this bishop, but also it's left this pawn unprotected. So the system basically involves trying to play queen to b6, attacking this pawn, and trying to follow it up with a bishop hunt. So that's exactly what happened in my game. After pawn to e3, queen to b6, attacking the pawn, white now has to figure out a way to defend the pawn. And a lot of the sharper lines in a lot of Londons, where maybe a knight could go here and you can sacrifice a pawn, are actually ruled out by the way that we've played. With a pawn on c6 rather than, for example, on c5, it's not so easy for white to get any of these usual tricks here. So something like this, if they have the Jobava London in their setup, this actually might just stymie them from move 1, because it does take away a lot of squares from any knight that was thinking of sacking the b-pawn. And if there's no good way to actually sack the b-pawn, white is going to need to defend it, either with queen to c1 or pawn to b3. We'll take a deeper look at the theory, but in this game that I'm going to show you, my opponent played queen to c1, and now I just played knight to h5, hunting down the bishop. And already here, my opponent made a big mistake. We are going to come back and we're going to look at different bishop moves that white might try, but in the game, my opponent played bishop to e5. And this is a mistake because d6 is a part of my plan. In the middle game, I'm going to be putting pawns on d6, g6, developing my bishop, and potentially playing for either e5 or potentially c5 to get my fair share of the center. So after the bishop retreats, I simply captured it right away. I put the pawn on g6, I developed my bishop, and I got to play e5. So here I'm already feeling very comfortable with my position. I've got my share of the center, I've got the 2 bishops. There's really not a lot that black can complain about here. The fact that the h-file is opened up is not even a big deal. Black will actually be able to very safely castle on the next turn or two, and really shouldn't have that many problems. Knight to f3 was played by my opponent, bishop to f5, and now came e4, I moved, and after knight to g5, my opponent is actually lost already. And one of the biggest problems is that this last move has actually hung this d-pawn. It's not very common that black already has this pressure without having a lot of other pieces developed, but here now my opponent will be losing this game. I started with h6, I kicked the knight back, it decided not to move back, and now we get this unusual situation where lots of pieces are hanging, and to further complicate it, I take on d4. This appears to be really strong to me. Now, not only is everything hanging, but this past d-pawn actually should be really, really strong. My opponent played knight to h4, attacking my queen, but now I can just simply deliver this check, and everything's hanging, but this d-pawn is really good. My opponent has more pieces hanging than me, so in this position, we were able to trade a bunch of the pieces. I win this knight, and now I'm up a piece with a very strong position. I just simply maneuvered my knight into the game. I just got a phone call. Where were we? What was I doing? I was crushing this guy. After rook to d1, I simply grabbed here. My queen was able to infiltrate, and I was able to win this game. So this actually is a very interesting system, this pawn to c6. I think it's a really interesting way for black to try to get a completely unique position against the London, and potentially get the opponent out of book and get them thinking right away. So we will come back to this position one more time, have a quick look at what can happen after queen to b6. b3 again is obviously a very reasonable option. b3 might actually even be the best move, but it will be difficult for some players to play like this and voluntarily weaken the dark squares on the queen side, especially with this bishop over here. But if you do play queen to c1 one more time, we definitely do have the time to go and win this bishop pair over here. And white should probably consider a different move than what was actually played in the game. Something like this only helped me a lot more than the opponent. So there are 2 other moves, but one of these actually falls for a very big trap. And the problem is, if they play bishop to g5, there's a very well-known idea in these kinds of positions of queen to a5, check, and we are going to be able to win a bishop. And this trap works like all the time in all sorts of openings, especially in the London. So what they really need to do is, if they don't want us to just take the bishop and ruin the pawns here, they want to play bishop to g3. And in this position, we can now grab this bishop. After they take back, we can play pawn to g6, something like this. And again, it's the same sort of system. We're just going to develop our bishop. We're going to put the pawn on d6. Then we will decide, do we want to try to break through with e5? Do we want to try to play c5? And I think it's a very reasonable, flexible approach by black. So one interesting option for white is to actually play pawn to b3, and this has the idea of actually stopping our secondary idea of just going and trying to hunt down this bishop. So we will now need to wait. So for example, if we play pawn to d6, we are hoping that they play a move like knight to f3, because now we once again have this idea of hunting down the bishop. So here again, if they do go to g3, we can just simply grab it. If they play bishop here, they actually have stopped us from playing queen to a5, because now this bishop would be defended, so that wouldn't make as much sense. But there is another way of hunting down the bishop. In this position, we can now play pawn to h6, and if they run back, we can now play g5, and something like this, so if they go back, we are again going to try to take it. But there are a lot of unusual things that can sometimes happen, because even here, our knight is aligned on the same diagonal as the opponent's queen. So for example, they might just move their knight and just say, if you take my bishop, I will take your knight. But here again, we actually do have a very interesting way of hunting down this bishop. We can simply just move the knight to g7, which is obviously a weird square for a knight, but the main idea is that after the bishop runs away, we play knight to f5, and one way or another, we actually are going to be able to just take that bishop next, and then go about our day developing all of our pieces. So if white actually wants to prevent all of this, if white understands our idea from the start, they might want to play a move like pawn to h3. And this just simply means that in no situation will we ever be able to go here, even if we play like here so that our knight would be defended, because after some random moves, if we ever go after it, they are going to be able to run away. So with that in mind, what we can do is we can still just play sort of normal. I would assume some sort of normal development for both sides would look something like this, where everybody might castle, and we'll be able to bring in our knight, and somehow, some way, we will eventually be able to play e5. We need to wait until the time where the situation is right. And another idea would also, in a position like this, especially with b3, could be to play for the c5 pawn break to try to open up this diagonal for our bishop. So our competing ideas are basically, should we try to play here to open up for our bishop, or should we try to play with some sort of moves, like we can get all of our pieces, we can even move this knight out of the way if we have to. We can eventually get e5 in this position with the idea of jamming their bishop. So do you want to play against their bishop? Do you want to try to liberate your own bishop? You have a lot of flexibility in a line like this. But I do just want to point out this very interesting idea of pawn to c6. The main idea is, one more time, play queen to b6, try to attack this pawn, and then try to hunt down this bishop somehow, some way. And now we will move on to the third approach. This is the one that actually sparked my interest in making this video for you guys. This is a game that I played an hour ago against somebody rated 2300 on Lichess. So in this game, I actually will show you a very aggressive and probably not so great way, but a very interesting combative way of playing the London as black. So in this game here, I just started right away with pawn to c6. I have sort of similar ideas where if the bishop ever comes out, I will be bringing my queen out to b6 right away. But instead of actually playing queen to b6 here right away, I had another unusual idea here as black. And my idea in this game is that, yeah, at some point I will play queen to b6. But I started with the very aggressive intention of h6, g5, bringing out my bishop this way, and then I did a very lofty knight maneuver to try to get a very aggressive position. So I played h6 here with the idea of playing pawn to g5, and only then, in some position, eventually we put our pieces kind of very similar to what we saw in the previous variation, but I just completed this lofty knight maneuver, brought the queen out to b6. So this is, I mean, we'll go back. It's a very interesting concept. You can play this way. You can just put your pawns on c6, d6, try to play h6, g5. I'm sure there are a lot of different ways. There's nothing in the database. If you play this way, you will just get a unique position every time, because there is no theory here. But I brought out my stuff, and the way that this one worked in this game was here after this capture. White actually got a little bit ambitious and took my knight here, and I think this actually is the losing move. So far, it's kind of the same idea, that now, again, I get to take here. And in all these lines, we saw it in the previous game, when you get this monster pawn here on d4, it's often very good for black. So I didn't recapture right away. I instead created yet another threat, and in this position here, now I took back the bishop, and this pawn gets to live, and this pawn is very strong, and suddenly I have a very good position. For now, I have the two bishops, but I also have some reasonable ideas of just developing. I'm going to castle on the queen side. This is a very aggressive line, and I even potentially have some very good squares for all of my pieces. And the reason I played here, attacking this pawn, is because now I actually do intend on taking this b pawn. If I had taken it earlier, there probably would have been some rook to b1, and white could have gotten some activity. So after the knight came here, shielding the c pawn, defending his b pawn, I simply developed my knight. Here, my piece was attacked, and I decided just to trade it off, get castled, complete my development, and looking around at the available squares here, I actually noticed that I do have knight to d5 potentially coming up, as well as a lot of pressure potentially on the f-file. So I still feel like all of my pieces are very sensible. I did play knight to d5. I put my rook on the f-file after I got checked here. It's worth noticing that if my opponent does take here, I had rook takes f3 in the position, could get very dangerous for the opponent. So the opponent drove the knight in. Here I simply traded, and here, and I was telling myself in the game, there's no way he's going to take this d-pawn. And then my opponent did. And so I played knight to f4 with some big ideas. This is a revealed attack on the queen, and I'm on this pawn. You don't have a good way of defending the pawn with the queen, because now I'm going to be able to play rook takes d3. And after he just decided to come in, I was able to grab this pawn. The opponent is getting into a little bit of a windmill here. I was able to give a couple checks, and here decided to sacrifice an exchange with the idea that if you now take, I take back with my queen, and I have a very powerful attack. So my opponent decided to play f3 to try to support all of this, but now I absolutely just crashed through. I give this check with the big idea of clearing the way for my queen, and this leads to an immediate checkmate. So if you're looking for something just absolutely aggressive against the London system, consider this setup: c6, d6, h6, g5, and then there's absolutely no theory. So you're on your own. But the big idea is no matter where white actually will play, it's very similar to the last line where we will have ideas of queen to b6, the bishop will go here, you'll put a knight here, and you will decide which way you want to break in the center, and you should get a very interesting game. So hopefully this was helpful, hopefully this inspired you to come up with some sort of interesting ideas against the London. If you are interested in these opening ideas, especially really rare stuff, that's what I do a lot on my channel, so please subscribe. Come on! Subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys for another video.